Hi, everybody. Welcome to our DAT Weekly Market Update. This is our update for August 13, episode 304. I'm Dean Craig, market analyst here at DAT, along with co-host Chad Kennedy. Hi, Chad.
Hey, Dean. How's it going?
Yeah, good, thanks. Good.
Good.
I'm out on the West Coast this week in the Pacific time zone, but you're back in Lakeland.
Yep, back in Lakeland. Got the storm behind us, Debbie, but I know it soaked the East Coast over the last week, so I'm glad to have that behind us. It looks like there's something else forming out there in the Atlantic, though. We can talk about a little bit.
Yeah, we had, there's obviously a lot of tragic deaths as a result of Debbie. It took its time to work its way up the East Coast. We got hit by it on Saturday. A lot of heavy flooding up through Pennsylvania and upstate New York, devastating flooding. It's quite the storm.
Yeah,
that one.
Yeah. Sad for those families impacted.
Yeah, just tragic. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about hurricane season towards the end of the show. We don't have a guest today, but it'll just be Chad and I. For those new to the show, we're here every Tuesday, 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific, talking about trends in the freight market. So let's get started with some of the key trends we're watching this week. Spot rates down slightly, tracking very closely to last year, as you'll see on some of the next slides. We're not surprised rates softened this week a little bit. Always start of the month they're a little bit weak, but demand is also a little bit weaker. As Jason Miller will report this week, his truckload ton mile index was down about 0.4% in June and about 0.7% compared to this time last year. According to Jason, the good news is it was the smallest negative seasonal adjustment year-over-year reading since the start of the current freight recession. Bill Cassidy had a great article out last week about the historic purge in US truckload carrier capacity. Collectively, all of the large truckload carriers that are publicly traded slashed capacity by about 9.5% year over year in the second quarter. The LMI came out. Zach Rogers' Logistics Managers Index came in at 56.5. That's up from the June reading of 55.3. That makes 8 consecutive months of expansion. Some of the nuanced writings that Zach has, inventory levels upstream were up and downstream inventories were down, suggesting retailers are keeping inventories lean at the start of Q3, while manufacturers, wholesalers and distributors built up goods in anticipation of increased demand. Great report. You can find that at the Logistics Managers Index website. We're writing a little bit about produce this week. It is shrink month. August is the highest shrink month in produce. Excessive heat, mature fruit, over-ordering and overstocking. Produce volumes, according to the USDA, down 7% nationally, but down 18% in California. They've got some really hot weather going on right now. About 40% of our truckload volume comes from California this time of the year. Imports out last week. Another surge in imports. It was the third highest monthly volume on record. Volumes were up about 11.2% month over month and almost 17% year over year. We're going to talk a little bit about hurricanes. We've got another one looming out in the Atlantic. Ernesto's on the back of Debbie. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. And lastly, this week's market update that'll be published this evening. We're looking at the history of the CAT scale over the last 50 years, invented by Bill Moon at the Iowa 80 truck stop. We've got an in-depth analysis on the LMI. We're talking about watermelon season, which is peaking this week out in the Evansville market. It was the number one commodity hauled last week. And, of course, a little bit of a wrap-up on the July ISM Purchasing Managers Index. All right, so let's start with our look at the freight market, the dry van load-to-truck ratio. Following the end-of-month boost in shipping volume from the prior week, load posts predictably slipped back last week by about 13%. Volumes are about 2% higher, though, than the week 32 number looking back over the last 7 years. So slightly higher volumes compared to non-pandemic years. Load-to-truck ratio was down slightly to 3.86. And in refrigerated, after being flat for the last 3 weeks, the volume of refrigerated load postings was down 11% last week. Produce volumes down, obviously impacting that. Carrier equipment posts were slightly lower. Load-to-truck ratio ended the week at 6.41. And in flatbed, load post volumes dropped 15% last week. They're about 1% higher than last year. Equipment posts were down 2%, and the load-to-truck ratio ended the week at 9.49 loads per truck. All right, so let's have a look at the year over year look at spot rates, after remaining flat through month end, dry van line haul rates decreased by a penny per mile last week to $1.63, about 2 cents a mile higher than last year. Rates have been bouncing along at this level for a little while now. I'm not surprised they were down a little bit at the start of the month. That's fairly normal. According to DAT's top 50 lanes, spot rates have dropped 2 cents a mile last week to $2 per mile based on the volume of loads moved. The top 50 lanes are about 37 cents a mile higher than the national average. In refrigerated, the national average line haul rate remained flat last week, averaging $1.97, about 2 cents a mile higher than last year, and also about 2 cents a mile lower than the 3-month trailing average. And lastly, in flatbed, the national volume of loads moved dropped by 7% last week, resulting in a loosening of flatbed capacity and a 2 cent per mile decrease in spot rates, dropping to $1.99. First time they've been under $2 a mile, excluding fuel, for many, many weeks. They're about 2 cents a mile higher than last year, and looking about 10 cents a mile higher than 2019, as you can see from the chart there. All right, let's have a quick look at our forecast for the week. Not a lot of change from last week. A little bit of model disagreement again with the short-term model for dry van. The short-term model more heavily weights recently seen data. Ratecast is based primarily on a lot of our seasonal activity, so it senses a lot more seasonality and tightening in the market. We think most of those Ratecast forecasts are picking up on some of the tightening of capacity as it exits the industry. That's still ongoing. Ratecast is looking for about a 3 cent per mile lift through the middle of September. We're starting to get into some decent shipping volumes, normally come in seasonally. I think that's what Ratecast is starting to pick up towards the end of that forecast range. Ratecast is down, the short term is down by about the same amount. In refrigerated, a lot of strong model agreement this week. Up about 5 cents a mile according to Ratecast. Short term is picking up on the same sorts of trends. We're not seeing a lot of good volumes in the produce market just yet, so I'm kind of a little bit nervous about what this is telling us. There's considerable softness in the produce market, which drives a lot of our reefer volume this year. So this could just be a picking up or a sensing of some of the capacity that's exiting the market. That's been going on for the last 2 to 3 weeks. And lastly, in flatbed, no change here from the last 4 model runs that we've done over the last month. Ratecast is predicting a 4 cent per mile drop. Short-term model is looking for about an 8 cent per mile drop to the middle of September. But that's fairly normal. Rates do not drop fairly considerably from June 1st to the end of September. So we're on track with what we would normally expect seasonally in flatbed. So that's it for the short terms. Remember, the long-term version of this long-form version of this report will be out this evening to get a copy of all of these charts. So over to you, Chad, for an update on the...
All right, so we'll take a look at what shippers' contract rates and spot rates are currently at. Everything Dean's covered prior to this has been from a broker to a carrier perspective. So our load board activity, that load to truck ratio, and spot procurement from broker to carrier. So what we have here is our weekly shipment volumes for van. So in blue, you can see the contract mix of shipments, 74% of shipments currently in that contract category and 26% in yellow in that spot category. This chart goes all the way back to 2016. And then you can see the black line there, the spot premium ratio. That's the premium for spot rates compared to contract rates. That's at -7%. And this is a great indicator of if the market's ready to turn or not as it starts to go over 0%. We do see it kind of trending in that direction. We did have that early July spike there, late June spike as we were getting ready for the holiday. This spot premium metric's been negative since April of 2022. It bottomed out the very bottom there, April of 2023, and had a more recent bottom, April of 2024. It's been rising since May with a slight dip there after the holiday spike that I just mentioned. Contract rates, interestingly, for dry van remain flat. They're dragging along what could be this prolonged bottom for contract rates. Although I did notice California contract rates have been higher year over year for June and July. And so they've been up about 3 to 4 percentage points since the bottom in April. So that's everything for dry van. We'll go on to temp control now, or reefer. Same chart here, contract mix at 83% and spot mix at 17%. and the spot premium ratio at -5. Again, that spot premium ratio is that difference between spot rates and contract rates. And then moving on quickly here to flatbed, 67% contract rates, pretty flat, bouncing around there, 33% spot shipments, and spot premium ratio still negative at -9%, a little dip down there recently towards the end of July. So that's everything on the contract rates.
All right, Chad, I'm just curious. Chris Kaplis wrote about the spot market, the split between contract and spot, and we'd always surmised that a 90-10 split was more realistic long-term until the pandemic. And then I remember Chris writing about it went up as high as 25% during the pandemic period there. You can see on that yellow line that you had up there. It's interesting that it's back to 26% now. Do you have some theories on why we've got such a high percentage of dry van freight moving in the spot market now?
Yeah, it is interesting. I think a lot of that contract, a lot of those contract rates are on drop trailers. I think we're starting to see maybe a little bit of routing guide leakage. We have heard from some of our shippers that they are starting to take some small contract rate increases. We're starting to see that. So as spot rates continue to rise a little bit, those alternatives in the marketplace do present opportunity for carriers to reject tenders and move more shipments into that spot category. We use an algorithm to detect spot shipments in our data. It's really an irregular lane rate. It's any lane rate that's reoccurred less than 4 days. So we're seeing more and more of that peak up a little bit here over the last month. But it is an interesting trend to watch. I think it supports the forecast that you just showed. So we'll see over the next month how it plays out.
Yeah, I listened to one of the earnings calls last week. I can't recall the carrier, but they did say that unplanned shipments are attracting a higher rate. So they were implying that spot market moves that were unplanned were no longer decreasing, but starting to show signs of increasing, which would support that increase in spot moves.
Yep. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah. All right. So let's get to one of the key questions that I'd like to sort of ask this week, and that's talking a little bit about what's going on in the hurricane world. It's hurricane season. I noticed the mid-season update came out last week from NOAA, just to sort of set the stage here. After Hurricane Debbie made landfall, we've now got Ernesto making some moves out in the Atlantic, according to the latest update. The National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, and I'll reaffirm some of their predictions, they still committed to a highly active season in 2024, citing near record sea surface temps. In its mid-season update, NOAA emphasised that both atmospheric and ocean conditions continue to support its initial May forecast. For those that were watching the show back then, they were calling for an above normal hurricane season. They estimate a 90% probability of an above average hurricane season, leaving just a 10% of near normal activity and virtually no chance of a below normal season. So they're predicting 17 to 24 named storms with winds of 39 miles an hour or higher. So that's what we're seeing now. I remember last year we had a similar forecast come out talking about above active season. It didn't materialize last year. Luckily this year, though, the conditions seem to be almost perfect for some of these nasty storms to develop. Out of the 8 to 13 storms are expected to escalate into hurricanes this season, with winds of 74 miles an hour and greater. And of those, 4 to 7 could further intensify into major hurricanes. So that's the forecast for this year. NOAA is sticking to it. That lines up pretty much with Colorado State University and AccuWeather. So Chad, you're kind of in the bullseye living in Lakeland, Florida, right? So what's this? We see a lot of news reports everywhere else in the country. People tend to get fairly spun up about hurricanes, but when we go to the news feeds in Florida, people seem a little bit less concerned. Is that sort of how things play out down there?
Yeah, I think so a little bit. I think, you do all the right things to prepare. You keep some food around and stock up on water and have a generator if you can, have that in place, and have your plans in place and just be prepared. And if evacuation comes, then you follow those orders and do the right thing. So yeah, we've been through a few of them. One blew through last week. Fortunately, it was pretty light down here. We did get 7.5 inches of rain. I got a little bit of leaking around a window, so we're getting that cleaned up. But it's really unfortunate what it's done up the East Coast there. I know a lot of rain there in Georgia, South Carolina, and even into Virginia. So, and even further north than that. I know that one's heading up in the Atlantic right now, fortunately predicted to head a little bit further off coast up the East Coast there. So hopefully we'll dodge a bullet there. But I know you were telling a story recently about one, was it Fiona, that they kind of followed a similar path, but hit Canada and caused some pretty bad damage there.
Yeah, this was back in 2022. I remember this one because it devastated the PEI potato crop at that time of the year. One of the biggest provinces for potatoes in Canada is in Prince Edward Island. But this was an interesting one because it was, I think it was August 2022. There were two hurricanes made landfall. One was Fiona was in the Canadian Maritimes after skirting the coast and not touching the US mainland. It made impact in Nova Scotia as a Cat 2. And just days before Hurricane Ian arrived in Florida and the Carolinas, we did see some substantial impact on the freight market in some of those big markets in Florida. And this is typically what we see when it hits, when it's very localized. Average outbound line haul rates went up 7 cents a mile in the week that Ian arrived. They'd been dropping for the 3 weeks prior to making landfall. Similar effect in Atlanta and Savannah. Rates are up 3 cents a mile and 8 cents a mile, respectively, in those two major markets. The reason that was the case in Atlanta and Savannah, they are two big markets that supply a lot of freight volume into Florida. So we typically see some impact in the weeks prior and the week after. It really depends on where it hits, whether it's a wind event or a flooding event. Those two types of events have a substantial difference. I was looking at our rates last week. We didn't see much tightening of capacity. Savannah, for example, rates down 2 cents a mile. Volumes were down, though, fairly significantly. The loads moved dropped 25% last week, which was a fairly big drop. Some of the other markets like Greenville saw volumes down about 6%, rates down 7 cents per mile. Same in Allentown. So what generally happens when you see weeks like that is obviously freight can't move and trucks can't get in there. So the results or the impact of hurricanes on freight markets are not necessarily immediately observable in rate movement and loads moved. We either see, typically in the spot market, a surge of volume and activity in the week prior and the week after if there's good notice. But from Debbie last week, I didn't see any measurable impact on spot rates just as of data as of last Saturday.
That makes sense, Dean, just from what we see down here in the retail stores the week before. Once you get the news of that storm coming in, and if you're in the path, the retail shelves start to thin out pretty well, and especially in the hardware stores, it would be difficult to find a generator a couple of days before a hurricane. So I think that there's some shipping activity before that. And then I'm curious, Dean, I know you've been out there on the road quite a bit. Have you been around in the market driving during one of these storms, and what's your strategy as you see that? Do you try to position yourself away from it, or do you head into it?
Older heads prevail. I usually park up and hide somewhere where I'm not going to get hit by anything. But it's interesting. A lot of people talk about weather in the context of slowing down capacity. A lot of more experienced drivers will pull over and slow down, whether it's a winter storm or a rainstorm or a windstorm. That just comes from experience. But as a driver, from a driver's perspective, you are taught to handle almost everything you can see, smell, and feel, right? So the only really bad, nasty weather that's diabolical is black ice, because you can't see it. So that's one thing that will stop, an interstate highway network in a heartbeat, notwithstanding the fact you've got a lot of whiteouts. But what you'll find typically is that drivers can keep going when there's high wind. Not so much when you're empty. If you're empty and you've got strong crosswinds, that can be disastrous. But most of the time when you're loaded, you can handle fairly sustained winds and rain. What a lot of people don't realize is when it's torrential rain, because the windscreen or the windshield is vertical, your visibility is absolutely perfect. So whereas a lot of cars, you have a sloped windscreen, you can't see out of it. So if you were driving your car and you couldn't see out of it, and I'm in my truck, I could see perfectly because the windscreen's vertical. So that's why, that's why you see trucks ripping down the highway in heavy rain, because their visibility is pretty good. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say that's nuts, but so is a lot of things you do in trucking.
Yeah, makes sense. So, hey, Dean, you mentioned some movement in rates in the market during Fiona or after that. I'm curious, nationally, is that something that we've picked up on the data? I think back to 2017, we had 3 Category 4 hurricanes hit. I think it was Harvey, Irma, Maria.
Yep.
Maria was down in Puerto Rico. In the market tightened significantly after that, and I don't know that it was attributed all to those. I think there were some other factors at play, but what have we seen in the data on a national level?
In the spot market, you tend to see when we have a really big event, so we had a big freeze this year that spanned multiple markets. Mid-January, rates went up about 12 cents a mile in that week and then retreated within about 10 days. Ida was a pretty big event. That moved the national rate needle. Rates went up about 6 cents a mile. Based on my experience with DAT's data over the last 4 years, it's unusual to see one hurricane move the national needle. You really do need a massive multi-market event that's sustained before you see, like the I-40 shut down during the polar vortex, and rates went up during that year and never really came back. That was a massive event. But that was, of course, a multi-region, the whole middle of the country basically froze. So it's unusual to see one hurricane make a big impact nationally. More likely, it's mostly regional, and then sometimes down to mostly an individual market like Lakeland or Houston, for example. It just, at the moment, there's still plenty of capacity to absorb all of the, it's a bit like the ocean market, right? When the Red Sea crisis hit and we had to run all of those big container ships around the Cape of Good Hope, there was sufficient capacity to absorb that extra transit time. It was the same thing when the Baltimore Bridge collapsed. There was sufficient flatbed capacity in the market to absorb the extra transit time. So right now, we've still got an excess of capacity to absorb whatever comes our way in terms of increased demand at a market level.
What about the FEMA loads, Dean? I've heard that FEMA will pay a premium to have loads moved when they need them moved, and that makes sense. It stands to reason. What have you observed in the marketplace? Has that made an impact on rates?
Yeah, I think FEMA's got a lot better. I know in prior jobs, we work with FEMA on sharing a lot of location data to help them figure out where capacity was, where it needed to be positioned. They've got a lot more data now than they had 5 years ago as to where to position freight and when. So notwithstanding that, you'll always see that last minute surge volume, but they have, and this name of the Air Force Base in Alabama always escapes me, but they have a really good location where they can stage a lot of this freight within about 5 hours of landfall. So a lot of the time you'll see the increased volume into a staging location, and then it will move once they know exactly where landfall is and it's safe to do so. So I think FEMA's got pretty good at that. Notwithstanding that, there is still a lot of surge volume that has to get positioned. A lot of trailers need to be rented. Yes, Maxwell Air Force Base is the name. Thanks, Ben. So that's what we see is there's a lot of inbound volume into those areas in that week leading up to the event. They're very good at handling these events right now. They tend to overcompensate because I think it's better to have too much material than not enough, because not enough is sometimes obviously not good for the local community, but it's also politically not helpful either if you screw up a massive emergency response. So I think from some of the bad experiences they've had in recent years, they've become very good at forecasting and then adding in some redundancy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, what about other industries? I'm thinking of the big box like lumber stores and things like that, the grocery store distribution network. I assume that they're getting wiped out on inventory before a storm and then trying to restock. And so I assume that's changing lanes and probably creating some volatility in the marketplace afterwards. I think of consistency is key when I'm trying to get low rates, especially on contract rates.
Right.
So I assume that kind of volatility of demand and supply moving around pretty quickly, kind of like what we saw around COVID there when things were opening and then closing pretty quickly. It created a lot of lane volatility. I assume that comes through in the rates.
Yeah, it does. It does. And I think that's what one of the earnings calls was alluding to last week, and that is unplanned freight was those rates were going up at a much faster rate. So I think that's what you see. When a market's tight like this, Chad, in the spot market, when you've had so much capacity exit, it doesn't take much to move the rate at a lane level. So I think what you'll find is when there's an excess of freight volume on a particular lane, that's where you'll see some fairly steep price increases because there's just not enough capacity to go around. Even though there is still an excess of capacity in the overall market, when you get down to a lane and a region level, that can tighten fairly quickly if you've got that surge volume. Tender rejection rates are one thing we'll have to watch. I'm looking forward to getting access to some of that data so we can see what the routing guide compliance levels look like.
That makes sense.
All right.
So we've had two storms have made landfall in the U.S. so far. Is that right? Beryl and Debbie. Hopefully not a third here in the next week. And how many did you say NOAA's predicting for the year? Was it 7?
17 to 31 named storms.
Wow. Yeah. So,
sorry, 17 to 23 named storms. My mistake.
Okay. Not all making landfall, hopefully. We'll see how this year plays out. Hopefully not too bad.
Yeah, it's one of those things we don't want to have happen at all, given the severity of some of the recent ones.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So that brings us to the end of the show. Let's some shout outs, some things to look forward to. Chris Kaplis is talking to Alex Leslie from ATRI about the cost of trucking in their latest report. Don't forget DATCon's coming up in Kansas City, October 22 to 24. You can go to dat.com/DATCon. Use code update100. Next week's show, great timing. Cody Kaler from ANZ Trucking is joining us. He's been on the show before. He's our local produce expert on the West Coast. There is talk of the transition from Salinas to Yuma, Arizona for the green, I'll call it the leafy green season. It's mostly lettuce. An early transition to Yuma, Arizona out of Salinas. That's interesting. That's about a month earlier than what we would normally expect. But Cody will be able to help us with that next week. Don't forget CVS Safety Week. Brake Safety Week, August 25, and that will see capacity sit on the sidelines again. Don't forget to sign up for alerts to the show. And with that, another show is in the books. Be safe, be nice to everyone, and we'll see you here next week at 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific.